let's go ahead and talk about the mortgage crisis of 2007 to 2010. Now, unfortunately, if you want to see an example of a situation that did not show integrity, objectivity, and good judgment, unfortunately, this is one of the biggest examples. And so, I realize that many of you in the listening audience may be banking experts. And so I realize that you may know far, far more about the crisis than I did, because this was a complicated situation and there were many different tendrils associated with the mortgage crisis. Many different groups acting, but unfortunately, all these different separate groups acting in their own short-term best interests caused a perfect storm to create the most devastating economic crisis since, of course, 1929, the Great Depression. And let's go ahead and sort of look at it from the bottom side and going up, okay? And I realize there's many other aspects to this that I won't be covering, but this is kind of the general idea that people in this particular case were looking at making maximum profit in the short run, but they were ignoring the fact that these business transactions really didn't make sense in the long run, and they were in essence killing the golden goose by doing this. And unfortunately, people, in fact, many of you, as a matter of fact, may have had absolutely nothing to do with real estate, mortgage lending, cement, whatever. You may have actually had nothing to do with building materials or anything of that nature, but yet, you ended up having the long-term effects from this particular situation. So let's go ahead and look at how this all worked. Okay, so well, let's kind of start with a personal example. So when my parents bought their first house in Oklahoma City in the 60s, the lending situation was far different than it is now. So, actually, as I was going through my mother's papers a few years ago, I ran across their initial mortgage application for this house in Oklahoma City. And the banks required my dad to not only show proof of his income, but they also required my dad to have letters of reference from his minister, his boss, and another friend to attest to his character. So in those days, when you borrowed money, the bank was stuck with you, and you were stuck with the bank for a good 30 years until the mortgage was paid off. So they were very careful of who they were lending money to make sure that you not only had the wherewithal to pay, but you had the character to pay what you owed. And then they were also very careful about the collateral that they were underwriting at this point. And so they wanted to make sure the house was had a good value, and so if things went south, that the bank's losses would be minimized. And and vice versa, we were stuck with that bank, and the bank was stuck with us. So things were a little bit different then. But unfortunately, lending practices changed towards the late 80s and early 90s, and of course it culminated in the big mess that we saw in 2007. And so really kind of, I think, hit its stride really in the mid 90s, late 90s, where all this there was the advent of the mortgage-backed securities. So what was happening was there were some groups out there I'll give as an example Countrywide Mortgages, where a few of my friends worked there for a period of time. But a lot of groups like Countrywide were underwriting mortgages, but the deal was they weren't holding on to those mortgages and servicing them. What they would do is they would sell them on to other groups. For instance, investment bankers like Goldman Sachs or Lehman's or Bear Stearns. And those investment bankers would go ahead and bundle up those mortgages, and they would sell like shares of stock with the bundle of mortgages being the underlying asset, or they would issue bonds, again, securitized by that bundle of mortgages. So in effect, the mortgage company wasn't stuck with you and you weren't stuck with them. What was going on is if the mortgage went bad, the bank wasn't going to be left holding the bag. The people being left holding the bag would be those who owned the bonds or the stock that was securitized by the bundle of mortgages. So from that standpoint, the way banks were making money and these investment bankers were making money was by, again, selling on the mortgages. They would go ahead and get a little cut at that point, and then the investment bankers like Bear Stearns or Lehman's, they would make their money by doing the IPO, or selling again, selling the shares of stock, or issuing the shares of stock, excuse me, or those particular bonds. And so at that point, they didn't really care what the mortgages looked like. And so the mortgage standards, in terms of underwriting those particular items, started really completely falling apart. And so at one point, I had a friend who worked for that Countrywide when it still existed. And he had been there for a good number of years. And one day I saw him and he said that he had quit. And I said, well, why did you quit? Because you don't even have another job lined up. And he says, well, I just couldn't take it anymore. He said that there was a individual who was a single parent who had a number of children that were dependent, and that person had a salary of about $38,000, but wanted to buy a house that was about $350,000 as a purchase price. And so he said he had told his boss that based on those numbers, that the customer would end up defaulting on the mortgage nearly immediately. And the boss said, I don't care, go ahead and get this underwritten. We're selling this on anyway, so we won't be responsible for the loss. And at that point, he just couldn't take it anymore. But that was indicative of kind of what was going on. So you had these mortgage-backed securities going on, and the value of them in the marketplace kept going up and up and up. And it was really kind of a speculative thing. And, exacerbating the situation, of course, was, groups like the ratings agencies, Standard and Poor's and Moody's and whatnot, where as the investment bankers were bringing the securities to be rated by Standard and Poor's or Moody's, they basically were rubber stamping them and allowing them to have AAA ratings, even though often what was inside the mortgage-backed securities was complete rubbish. And their thought process at the time was, well, if I go ahead and if I don't go ahead and give it a AAA rating when the banks come in, then they're just going to take their money and go to our competitors down the street, and our competitors will go ahead and rubber stamp a AAA rating. So in essence, their thought process was, I'm going to go ahead and cheat first before my competitor has a chance to cheat. So, of course, then the securities weren't properly rated, and the investing public, of course, allowed themselves to be duped in that manner. And so then you move on to the next situation where you have, for instance, AIG and those reinsurers, and who started off being, in many cases, thinly capitalized. They had a lot of debt on their balance sheets, and yet they were willing to go ahead and say, hey, we're going to go ahead and write insurance policies in effect on these mortgage-backed securities. And by doing so, we can we're happy to take your premiums and make a lot of money that way, because after all, heck, mortgage-backed securities are going up, up, up. Okay, well, there are many people out there who, had they looked at the mortgage-backed securities a little bit more closely, would have realized that it was all, again, speculation, and these were actually very poor quality investments. But they were all riding that pony, and so AIG was willing to take these premiums. But when things started falling apart and they started having to pay on those policies, it didn't take long for basically AIG to be completely wiped out in terms of equity on their balance sheet. And so then, of course, we all remember that they, along with some of the other banking entities, were bailed out. And of course, whose money was that bailed them out? It was, of course, the taxpayers' money. And I don't know about you, I can tell you that anecdotally from my own personal experience and looking at the people who are living in my neighborhood, that there were a lot of people who had absolutely nothing to do with the mortgages or real estate or anything. And ultimately, we all had a tough economic time. We had a lot of people out of work, a lot of people taking pay cuts, a lot of people losing their houses because they'd lost their jobs. And more telling, I have graduate students now who are in their 20s, but they were in junior high when all this occurred, and they tell me stories about how hard it was for them growing up with both mom and dad having lost their jobs, and the kind of the travails they went through. And so it's caused great scars on a lot of individuals. Okay, and then of course you add in the role of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. You have also the role of the SEC, which arguably did not regulate or police the situation the way they probably should have, and so on and so forth. And so you have a whole lot of people looking after their own short-term best interests, trying to make a lot of quick, fast money. And of course, it ended up in a tremendous amount of devastation. Now, the question that we have here is, what role did the CPA firms have in this? And that's actually a very good question. Were the CPA firms out there saying, no, 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 let's not do this, this stuff is rubbish, or were they, in some cases, complicit in the situation? And I am sorry to say that, the Wall Street Journal reports in the case of Lehman Brothers, it appears that, as an example, their external auditor seemed to have turned a blind eye to some of the stuff going on, and that was, part of the situation that occurred. So the Wall Street Journal talks about Lehman Brothers. They ran ahead and ran a series of stories a few years ago, and Lehman Brothers, as you know, was a storied Wall Street banking firm that had been around for well over 100 years, in fact, maybe even 150 years, and they had hundreds of thousands of employees worldwide. But what they had on their balance sheet were these mortgage-backed securities, and they were rotten. And so as a result, what ended up occurring was as these mortgage-backed securities started to deteriorate in quality, the Lehman's engaged in what was called Repo 105. And this transaction entailed selling some of these rotten assets off the balance sheet shortly before close, and they would go ahead and sell them off to a third party, a willing third party. And so those rotten securities were off the balance sheet when year end happened. And so, of course, the balance sheet there would be a snapshot taken of the balance sheet, and the mortgage-backed securities were nowhere to be found, and they were replaced with something much more palatable like cash or good notes receivable or what have you. But then, unsurprisingly, a few weeks after close, those mortgage-backed securities would find their way back onto the Lehman balance sheet. And, it was just basically a round-trip transaction. And so what the Wall Street Journal reported was one of the big four was the external auditor for this particular, for Lehman Brothers. And Lehman's, as it turns out, was I believe it was the number 7 or number 11 client in that particular firm's roster, and they had been one of the leading clients for a good number of years, and the firm was earning millions upon millions of dollars in audit fees from Lehman Brothers. So clearly there was high motivation not to lose this client. And as it turned out, the Wall Street Journal reports that a young audit manager from this Big Four firm was going through some papers and ran across this transaction called Repo 105, which is this round trip sale that I mentioned. And he was confused, didn't know anything about it, and decided, well, I'll reach out to my counterpart over at Lehman's and find out if this guy knows what's going on. And so his counterpart was a VP of finance, and this guy didn't know what was going on either. So both of these gentlemen ended up running up the transaction through their own respective flagpoles. And what they discovered was that, almost immediately, the VP of finance over at Lehman Brothers resigned for personal reasons, i.e. he probably found out something he shouldn't, and they potentially just bought him off and told him to stay silent. And the audit manager for the Big Four firm was quickly reassigned to another client, and so the situation perpetuated itself until ultimately, as you know, Lehman had a sudden collapse, and the collapse of Lehman's and Bear Stearns in mid-2008 was what they considered the high watermark of the Great Recession. And of course, when that happened, it was just mayhem, and people didn't know when this was going to end. And this was clearly completely devastating, which led to a lot of this bank restructuring and et cetera. And frankly, the Treasury Secretary at the time, with such a huge, devastating loss in our economy, really was wondering whether the economic devastation to the United States was so great and the devastation to the world economy was so profound that he was wondering in his head whether or not we would be wearing loincloths and throwing rocks at each other because our economy had been so utterly destroyed. And so now clearly it's much later, and we look back and we realized that yes, we have indeed turned the corner, and things are robust, and we have low unemployment, and things are going well for our country now, and we certainly made our way out of the Great Recession. But at the time, we really didn't know. It was really tough, and it was all based on a whole lot of different groups kind of doing their own thing, right? And then looking at their own short-term best interests, as I mentioned.